Superfriends is an American animated television series about a team of superheroes, which ran from 1973 to 1986 on ABC as part of its Saturday morning cartoon lineup. It was produced by Hanna-Barbera and was based on the Justice League of America and associated comic book characters published by DC Comics. The name of the program have been variously represented at different points in its broadcast history. There were a total of 109 episodes and 2 backdoor-pilot episodes of the new Scooby-Doo movies, with Batman and Robin appearing in the Dynamic Scooby Doo Affair, and the Caped Crusader Caper. Series titles. Over the years, the show existed under several titles: Superfriends, The All-New Super Friends Hour, Challenge of the Super Friends, The World's Greatest Super Friends, Superfriends, Superfriends, The Legendary Superpowers Show, The Superpowers Team, Galactic Guardians. Writing. Plotlines for the later series involved many of the familiar DC Comics supervillains, but the first incarnation of the Super Friends did not. Instead, like the comic books, they focused on the far-fetched schemes of mad scientists and aliens, who were invariably revealed as being well-intentioned, and simply pursuing their goals through unlawful or disreputable means. Typically, at the end of each story, a peaceful and reasonable discussion would be performed by the heroes to convince the antagonists to adopt more reasonable methods. The all-new Super Friends Hour departed somewhat from the previous series formula by featuring villains using more elaborate methods to further their goals. As a rule, they could not be reasoned with, requiring the heroes to use direct force to stop them. Beginning with Challenge of the Super Friends, several of the heroes' arch-villains from the comic books began to feature prominently in comic-style stories. Throughout the series, plots often wrapped themselves up neatly in the final minutes of an episode in the fashion of the typical comic books and Deus Ex Machina. Production history. When animation company Hanna-Barbera acquired rights to the DC Comics characters and adapted the Justice League of America comic book for television, it made several changes in the transition, including the change of name to Super Friends. Nevertheless, team members sometimes referred to themselves as the Justice League on the show. The violence common in superhero comics was toned down for a younger audience and to adhere to broadcast standards governing violence in 1970s children's television. As a DC Comics-based show, the Super Friends franchise was owned by DC's parent company Warner Bros., who later put the series into syndication. Thus, Cartoon Network, which had the rights to air most of the rest of the Hanna-Barbera library from its inception in 1992, was not able to air Super Friends until after the merger of Warner Bros. Parent company Time Warner and Cartoon Network parent company Turner Broadcasting System was completed in 1996. This merger also led to Warner Bros. Taking control of Hanna-Barbera and all of its other assets as well. 1973 1974 series equals. Super Friends first aired on ABC on September 8, 1973, featuring well-known DC characters Superman, Batman and Robin, Wonder Woman, and Aquaman. Superman, Batman and Robin and Aquaman had each previously appeared in their own animated series produced by Filmation, and voice talent from these prior programs was brought in to work on the new show. Shortly before the Super Friends series was developed, Superman and Wonder Woman also guest-starred in 2 episodes of The Brady Kids, while Batman and Robin appeared in 2 episodes of the new Scooby-Doo movies. In addition to the superheroes, a trio of sidekicks was introduced, each of whom were new characters not drawn from the comic books: Wendy and Marvin and Wonder Dog, none of whom had any special abilities. Inspired by the Scooby-Doo gang, the trio, or at least its human member Sir, were depicted as detectives and or superheroes in training. Each episode began with the heroes responding to an emergency detected by the massive Draw Alert computer in the Hall of Justice, which served as the headquarters of the team. Colonel Wilcox, a U.S. Army official, was a recurring character who would act as a government liaison with the Super Friends during emergencies. Colonel Wilcox was voiced by John Stevenson. Conflicts were usually resolved with the antagonists persuaded to adapt more reasonable methods to achieve their aims. Natural disasters triggered by human activity were often shown, and environmental themes featured strongly in the program. 3 other DC Comics superheroes were featured as guest stars during this season: The Flash, Plastic Man, and Green Arrow. This first run of Super Friends, consisting of 16 one-hour episodes which were rerun several times, concluded on August 24, 1974. At this point, the series was cancelled. However, interest in superheroes among ABC's primetime viewers caused the network to revive Super Friends. The original 16 episodes of the series were rebroadcast as a mid-season replacement, running from February 7, 1976, to September 3, 1977. These episodes were edited into half-hour versions. At the same time, DC Comics published a Super Friends comic, which used Wendy and Marvin from issue number 1 to number 6. In the meantime, Hanna-Barbera began production on a revamped version of the show. 1977 a Euro 1978 season, the all-new Super Friends Hour equals. The all-new Super Friends Hour featured 4 animated shorts per program. Wendy, Marvin and Wonder Dog were dropped from this and all future TV iterations of Super Friends, and were replaced by Wonder Twins Zan and Jaina, and their pet monkey, Gleek. Unlike Wendy and Marvin, Zan and Jaina had actual superpowers. Daryl McNeil of the Hanna-Barbera Animation Studios later explained the change in cast. When the decision was made by ABC to renew Super Friends 3 years after the first series' 1973 production, ABC and Hanna-Barbera wanted to ramp up the series' action content. And since we were ramping that up, that meant making all of our cast a bit more serious, and giving our 5 leads a bit more backup than 3 non-powered sidekicks. New sidekicks also helped emphasize the new and all-new Super Friends. Emphasis in original. The show followed a basic format each week. The first segment of every show featured 2 of the heroes teaming up in a separate mini-story. The second segment featured a story with the Wonder Twins. The third segment was considered the primary adventure of the week, featuring the entire Super Friends roster in a longer adventure. The fourth and final segment featured a story with one of the primary lineup and a special guest star. This segment typically featured a problem that was solved using the guest star's unique abilities. Between segments there were short spots with members of the Super Friends giving basic safety lessons, providing first aid advice, demonstrating magic tricks, creating crafts, and presenting a 2-part riddle featuring the week's primary plot line. This was the first season to feature 2 villains appearing in the comic books, Black Manta and Gentleman Ghost. Black Manta's costume was not black, and he was only referred to as Manta. Both he and Gentleman Ghost only appeared in 1 episode this season, referred to as Gentleman Jim Craddock. 1978 a Euro 1979 season, Challenge of the Super Friends equals. The next season of Super Friends featured 2 segments. First segment, Super Friends episodes. The first segment of the program featured the established group of heroes, Superman, Batman and Robin, Aquaman, Wonder Woman, the Wonder Twins and Gleek. They were rerun with intro from the all-new Super Friends Hour when in syndication in the early 1980s, but they are seldom seen in syndication since then. Second segment, Challenge of the Super Friends. The second half-hour of the show introduced the Legion of Doom, a team of 13 recurring foes who are the Super Friends' worst enemies. They used a swamp-based mechanical flying headquarters, the Hall of Doom, as a contrast to the Super Friends' gleaming Hall of Justice. Additional heroes who had previously appeared as guest stars were added to the roster as well, to make a total of 11. These included The Flash, Green Lantern and Thanagarian lawman Hawkman from DC Comics and 3 Hanna-Barbera creations, Black Vulcan, Apache Chief, and Samurai. Despite the Riddler showing a set of playing cards with Gleek, Zan, Aquaman, Wonder Woman, Robin, Batman, and Superman, the Wonder Twins and Gleek did not appear in Challenge. Enthusiasts have expressed the view that the storylines for the Challenge episodes were the Super Friends era's best portrayal of the DC heroes. The Challenge of the Super Friends segment was expanded to 90 minutes mid-season, with reruns of earlier episodes filling out the last half hour. 1979 a Euro 1980 season, The World's Greatest Super Friends equals. In the fall of 1979, the Super Friends returned to their prior format, bringing back the original set of 5 DC superheroes and Zan, Jaina and Gleek. 8 one-hour episodes were created for this run, with the majority of the season consisting of repeats of the all-new Super Friends hour from 1977 to 1978. Renamed the world's greatest Super Friends, this series began on September 22, 1979, and ran until September 27, 1980. 1980 Euro 1982 seasons, Super Friends equals. Renamed Super Friends in 1980, the series changed formats again, abandoning the production of half-hour episodes and producing 7-minute shorts. Each episode of Super Friends would feature a rerun from one of the previous 6 years and 3 new shorts. These new adventures featured appearances by the core group of 5 Super Friends and Zan, Jaina and Gleek. There were also guest appearances from members previously depicted in Challenge of the Super Friends and the Hanna-Barbera created hero El Dorado, who was added to the show in 1981 to provide cultural diversity. This would prove to be one of the longer-lived incarnations of the series. 1982 Euro 1983 season, the best of the Super Friends equals. For the 1982 Euro 1983 television season, ABC ran half-hour reruns of shows from the previous 7 seasons, with none of the 7-minute shorts rebroadcast. ABC called the rerun package the best of the Super Friends. 1983 Euro 1984 season, cancellation and the lost episodes equals. Hanna-Barbera and Warner Brothers had created a syndication package of the earlier Super Friends series. These were picked up by stations across the United States and typically broadcast on weekday afternoons. Not wishing to compete with the syndication programming, ABC dropped the series from the 1983 Euro 1984 Saturday morning television lineup. For the second time, Super Friends was cancelled. However, during this time Hanna-Barbera continued to produce new episodes with the Super Friends, with ABC's approval and funding. In total, 24 lost episodes were produced, but not aired in the United States that season. The series appeared in Australia. 3 of these episodes were aired when Super Friends returned to Saturday morning ABC television the following year. The remainder aired on the USA Network in 1995, as part of the Superman-Batman Adventures show. 1984 Euro 1985 season, Super Friends, the legendary superpowers show equals. Super Friends returned to ABC Saturday, September 8, 1984, with a new 30-minute program typically featuring 2 11-minute stories per episode. This incarnation featured Superman, Batman, Robin, Wonder Woman, the Wonder Twins and Gleek, this time teamed up with Firestorm. In addition to this core group, episodes during the season also featured cameos by old Super Friends. The series ended August 31, 1985, and featured comic book villains such as Brainiac, Lex Luthor, Mirror Master, Mr. MXYZPTLK, Darkseid and his henchmen from Apocalypse. This season and the next featured the Superpowers tagline, which was part of a marketing tie-in with a toy line of the same name produced by Kenner. 1985 Euro 1986 season, the Superpowers team, Galactic Guardians equals. In fall 1985 the next version of Hanna-Barbera's depiction of the DC Comics heroes began, although it no longer carried the Super Friends name. This series returned to a conventional lineup for the team, with a focus on team members Cyborg and Firestorm. Once again headquartered at the Hall of Justice in Metropolis, the heroes battled such familiar foes as Lex Luthor, Brainiac, the Scarecrow and recurring villain Darkseid. It also contained the only appearances by the Joker, the Penguin, the Royal Flush Gang and Felix Faust. The Superpowers team, Galactic Guardians, lasted 1 season before being cancelled. The final new episode aired was The Death of Superman on November 6, 1985. This third cancellation would be the final one, and Galactic Guardians marked the end of Hanna-Barbera's 13-year run of the series on September 30, 1986. Characters equals the Justice League of America equals, the core group of 5 heroes made up the Super Friends. Additional Justice League members included, the Atom, Firestorm, the Flash, Green Lantern, Hawkgirl, Hawkman, DC Comics characters who are not Justice League members in comics, only on the series, Cyborg, Rima the Jungle Girl, Justice League members created for the series, Apache Chief, Black Vulcan, El Dorado, Samurai. One-shot Justice League appearances were made by Abensur, Green Arrow, Plastic Man, Superboy, the Teen Sidekicks and their pets, Gleek, Wonder Dog, Wendy and Marvin, Wendy Harris, Marvin White, Wonder Twins, Jaina, Zan. Other DC comic characters that appeared in the series, Commissioner James Gordon, Hippolyta, Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, Alfred Pennyworth, Solova, Steve Trevor. Legion of Doom 13 villains composed the Legion of Doom during the challenge of the Super Friends season. They were other DC Comics villains villains appearing independently from the Legion of Doom, villains appearing not adapted from the comic books, the Alien Mummy, the Antimatter Monster, Barco, Bigfoot Creatures, Blackbeard, Bulga the Behemoth, the Brain Creatures, the Capricorn Kid, Captain Shark, the Collector, the Incredible Crude Oil Monster, Darkon, Dicta and the Mysterious Time Creatures, the Dollmaker Dracula Drive Cranium Dr. Droid, Dr. Frankenstein, Dr. Fright, Dr. Gulliver the Earth Oars, the Enforcer, Giant Snow Creature, the Highway Angels, the Hydronoids, the Ice Demon, Insector and the Arthropods, the Iron Cyclops, John Pallet, the Junk Creature from the Dump, Corey Mazar, Keel Hall Kelly, King Arthur, the Lion Men, the Makeup Monster, Mal Havoc, the Man-Beasts of X-Ray, the Marsh Monster, Medulla and her Mind Maidens, Monga, the Mummy of Nazar, the Mysterious Mutants of the Space Sphere, Nartan, the Sinner and the Ancient Atlantean Warriors, Old Man Holmes, Orville Gump, the Outlaws of Orion, the Phantom Zone Villains, the Plant Creatures, Professor Amazon, Professor Firo, Professor Koloff, the Power Pirate, the Robber Baron and Sleeves, Rock and Roll Space Bandits, Rokan, ROMAC. The Secret Four, Scorpio, Sculpin, Sinbad and the Space Pirates, Solderath and the Lava Men, the Space Dolls, the Evil Space Genie, the Space Racers, Star Energy Creature, Super Enemies, Termites from Venus, Tirana, Tyrannic, Vampires, the Voodoo Vampire, Una the Terrible, Zarnam, the Zoons, Zykri. In the animated series Justice League Unlimited, Gorilla Grodd reforms his secret society, this time an even larger group of villains. While not called the Legion of Doom, their headquarters is a craft similar to the Hall of Doom, located in a swamp. Other DC comic characters in Super Friends comics and merchandising related to the series Batgirl, Black Canary, Black Orchid, Cyclotron, Elongated Man, Green Fury, Global Guardians, Dr. Mist, Ice Maiden, Little Mermaid, Seraph, Tasmanian Devil, Golden Pharaoh, Huntress, Captain Marvel, Mary Marvel, Mr. Miracle, Orion, Red Tornado, Supergirl. References to the Justice League of America name, beginning with the original Super Friends season, the opening narration describes the team's headquarters as the Great Hall of the Justice League. The opening credits of Challenge of the Super Friends names the Super Friends as the Justice League of America. In addition to the appearance of a JLA emblem on a communicator and a reference to a mission to repair the Justice League satellite, the Super Friends are often linked with the JLA. The Justice League satellite under repair is clearly the same design as the Justice League satellite that appeared in the comics at the time, but was shown to be substantially smaller than its comic book counterpart. Notable voice actors. The voice of the narrator was provided by actor Ted Knight during the early hour-long episodes. Bill Woodson took over with the revival of the series in 1977. His signature line was "Meanwhile, at the Hall of Justice." The voices of Marvin and Wonder Dog as well as Mr. MXYZPTLK, Toyman, the Dollmaker, Darkseid, Calabac and the Joker were performed by Frank Welker. Adam West provided the voice of Batman in Super Friends, the legendary Superpowers show and the Superpowers team, Galactic Guardians. Casey Kasem provided the voice of Robin. René Auberjonois lends his voice as Deesad. Reception. In January 2009, IGN listed Super Friends as the 50th best animated television series. DVD releases. Spin-offs. Legends of the Superheroes . On January 18 and 25, 1979, Hanna-Barbera ran two, one-hour live-action specials under the umbrella title Legends of the Superheroes. The first special, subtitled The Challenge, was loosely based on the Super Friends and the 1960s Batman series and included several other DC characters who replaced Samurai, Black Vulcan, and Apache Chief, Black Canary, the E2 Huntress Helena Wayne, and Captain Marvel. The second special, entitled The Roast, featured Ed McMahon as MC of The Roast, along the lines of the Dean Martin Celebrity Roast specials. Due to Warner Brothers' contracts on Wonder Woman and Superman, they were unable to be featured on the specials. The Plastic Man comedy adventure show . Plastic Man first appeared in the first season of Super Friends, in one episode. Later, Ruby Spears Productions released a series starring the character in his own solo adventures. Batman . A Batman animated series was also considered in the mid-1980s, presumably with Adam West reprising his role as the voice of Batman. The Fear was written as a pilot episode for the series, but it was instead adapted into an episode of the Superpowers team, Galactic Guardians. The New Teen Titans . In 1983, a cartoon based upon the New Teen Titans comics began development. It was created as a companion for the Super Friends, to be set in the same continuity. Robin wasn't going to be featured in the cartoon though, at least not as a regular, since in the Super Friends universe, he was a member of the Justice League. Like Super Friends, the show was to be developed by Hanna-Barbera for ABC, but since shows like The Smurfs were so popular at the time, this show was never picked up by the network. The show would have featured Wonder Girl as the leader, along with Cyborg, Kid Flash, Changeling, Raven and Starfire. Although the show failed to get picked up, a television commercial with a substance abuse theme did feature the Titans, as they would have appeared in the animated series, along with a new superhero named the Protector, who would have been the replacement character for Robin. A Teen Titans animated TV program was eventually produced, adding Robin and removing Wonder Girl, Kid Flash, and the Protector. Superman . In 1988, just 2 years after the final season of Super Friends, a new series created by Ruby Spears Productions that featured a solo Superman aired on CBS. In the episode called Superman and Wonder Woman vs. the Sorceress of Time, Wonder Woman guest stars, and Mary McDonald Lewis voices her. DC Super Friends . Fisher-Price developed a toy line named DC Super Friends featuring DC Comics characters as toys for young children. A comic book series and direct-to-video original animation called The Joker's Playhouse was developed to tie in. The video features the world's greatest Super Friends theme, allusions to the Legion of Doom, and the Super Friends and their Hall of Justice. To watch a full array of clips, visit http://www.batterypop.com/DC Super Friends. Comic books. Super Friends . The first use of the Super Friends name on a DC Comics publication was in limited collector's edition C41, which reprinted stories from Justice League of America No. 36 and 61 and featured a new framing sequence by writer E. Nelson Bridwell and artist Alex Toth. DC published a comic book version of the Super Friends from November 1976 to August 1981. The comic book series was launched by E. Nelson Bridwell and artist Rick Estrada. Zan and Jaina were given backstories and secret identities as a pair of blonde-haired high school kids. They were more competent heroes than their cartoon counterparts. While the television cartoons were not part of the same fictional universe as the DC comic books, writer E. Nelson Bridwell made the comic book accord with the other DC titles via footnotes. An example of trying to fit Super Friends into the DC universe, Wendy, Marvin and Wonder Dog were the only ones active at the Hall of Justice, because the Justice League are in the 30th century with the Justice Society. Robin was busy helping the Titans in Teen Titans No. 50-52. Bridwell also gave them last names and ties to the other characters' histories. Wendy Harris was the niece of Detective Harvey Harris and Marvin White was the son of Diana Prince. While the show never explained the departure of Wendy, Marvin and Wonder Dog, the story was found in Super Friends number 6/9. The argument for the comic being part of the Earth 1 continuity also included the fact that certain elements of the series impacted other books in the DC line. Because the Super Friends stories were referenced in the events in them remembered by the characters in the core DC superhero titles, for example, in Justice League of America number 155. They have to be considered part of the pre-Crisis Earth 1 ensemble of stories. In 2008, DC began publishing a new Super Friends comic book starring Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, Flash and Green Lantern. Based on the eponymous Imagine X toy line, it is aimed at children, with an art style reminiscent to that of Marvel's Superhero Squad. Collected editions, Super Friends, for Justice. Super Friends, calling all Super Friends, head of the class, Super Friends, mystery in space. Extreme Justice in the comics, the Wonder Twins were members of the short-lived JLI offshoot, Extreme Justice. Young Justice Young Justice was a comic series that followed the adventures of a group composed of the latest teen superheroes of the late 1990s and early 2000s, including Robin, Superboy, Impulse and Wonder Girl. Towards the end of the run, Young Justice was involved in a mission which required them to invade an island whose population was made up of supervillains. In order to conduct a successful attack, the core team assembled all the then-known teen heroes. As in Extreme Justice, neither spoke English and both seemed to enjoy eating CDs. Unlike their cartoon counterparts, the Wonder Twins were rude and sarcastic. Super Buddies The light-hearted nature of the show was spoofed in the 2000s with 2 DC miniseries, formerly known as the Justice League and I Can't Believe It's Not the Justice League. In these miniseries the group is known as the Super Buddies, and consists of a team of ex-Justice League members. A television advertisement for the team shows them posing in the postures of the original Super Friends title card. Teen Titans As of issue number 34, Wendy and Marvin were part of the DC continuity. They are now fraternal twins, engineering geniuses, and are employed at Titan's Tower as maintenance crew and mechanical troubleshooters. They were responsible for restoring Titan's member Cyborg to full functionality after he sustained damage to his artificial body parts during the events of the Infinite Crisis mini-series. Wonder Dog was also introduced in the series, although he was not a lovable sidekick but a murderous, shape-shifting demon dog who was sent to Titan's Tower to kill the team. Wonder Dog killed Marvin and attacked Wendy, leaving her crippled from the waist down. Wendy is a supporting character in the Batgirl series, where she receives help accepting her disabilities from former Batgirl Barbara Gordon. Justice League of America During the events of the 2005 company-wide Infinite Crisis crossover, the Justice League Watchtower was destroyed by Superboy Prime, leaving the JLA without a base of operations. To that end, the team established the Hall of Justice in Washington, D.C. to act as an embassy for the team and an emergency base of operations if needed. In the continuity of the comics, the hall was designed by Green Lantern and Wonder Woman. In Justice League of America number 46, Samurai made his first appearance in the DC Universe, where he was shown as one of the heroes driven temporarily insane by Alan Scott. Wizard Magazine Issue number 77 of Wizard Magazine parodied the Super Friends. The JLA was sent through a dimensional rift and met some of the Super Friends. After Martian Manhunter used his Martian vision to melt the villain and his machine, the Super Friends decided to send the Justice Leaguers back to their own dimension. As a jest, the magazine also ran an April Fool's promotion for a Wonder Twins special by painter Alex Ross. The book, entitled Wonder Twins, Form of Water, was to be one of Alex Ross' oversized books chronicling the Justice League. The plot was Suzanne and Jane are using their powers to help the Earth's famine and drought-stricken nations after their monkey, Gleek, contracted super rabies from severe dehydration. Bumpers, Cartoon Network produced 3 bumpers lampooning the Super Friends, One dealt with the idiosyncratic nature of the Legion of Doom and Brainiac's odd manner of dress. The second dealt with the Wonder Twins' uselessness in battle. The third, co-starring the Powerpuff Girls, dealt with Aquaman's useless powers and the level of violence compared with recent cartoons. Wonder Woman and Aquaman look away while the Powerpuff Girls beat up the Legion of Doom, setting the Scarecrow on fire. Notable was Bubbles' double entendre reply to Wonder Woman's compliment on how they were developing as superheroes. "One day we'll be as developed as you are." Lex Luthor began laughing. His underlings understood the joke and laughed as well. When a piece of the Hall of Doom's ceiling fell on Luthor's head, everyone laughed. When the Powerpuff Girls came crashing in, Luthor mispronounced their collective name as the Powderpuff Girls, annoying the Powerpuff Girls and causing them to angrily correct him, "It's Powerpuff. No D." The fourth, co-starring Ben 10, Superman, Aquaman, Wonder Woman and Batman are drinking coffee and discussing about the new kid Ben Tennyson. Wonder Woman tells Batman he's envious of Ben, and she wonder maybe because he has superpowers? Batman just torment, however Superman agrees Wonder Woman's point, then explains that Aquaman can talk to fish, and that he can fly. "But you're just a loaded guy with a rubber mask, an expensive car and a funny belt." Just then, Ben walks into the break room and getting his lunch. Batman greets him not quite friendly at first, however after Ben asks Batman for his autograph, Batman feels pleased. He then asks the other superhero if they want half of his sandwich and Aquaman takes it. Ben then tells Superman that he has Superman pajamas, let Superman makes him a day. Ben then leaves the break room, all heroes feel happy to Ben's nice side for them. And Aquaman chimes in, saying it was cool that he gave him half of his tuna sandwich. Suddenly their mood turns very awkward. Adult Swim has also produced bumpers parodying the Superfriends. The first was a clip from the episode The Time Trap, with bleeping edited in to give the appearance of profanity. They produced similar clips using other Hanna-Barbera cartoons. In another bumper, they lampoon the manner in which the Super Friends described every action before completing it. In this commercial, the heroes went to a movie and struggled to find money for popcorn. Several bumpers consist of little more than Aquaman walking into a realistic photograph and then proceeding to dance to some rump-shaking music. Other DC programs. Justice League At the end of Secret Origins, the premiere 3-episode arc of Justice League, Superman proposes the formation of a superhero coalition including himself, Batman, Wonder Woman, The Flash, the Green Lantern, the Martian Manhunter, and Hawkgirl. In a direct reference, The Flash jokingly asks if such a team would be called Super Friends. Superman relabels the Guild as the Justice League. Justice League Unlimited The Legion of Doom appeared as the primary antagonists of the final season of Justice League Unlimited, complete with the group's trademark skull-shaped lair from Super Friends. Additionally, the Justice League's Metro Tower headquarters in Metropolis strongly resembled the Hall of Justice. The Ultimen, loosely based on characters created for the Super Friends, were briefly allies and later antagonists to the JLU. The Ultimen consisted of Long Shadow, Juice, Wind Dragon, Downpow and Shifter. The group appeared in the episode Ultimatum, where it is revealed that they are clones created by Project Cadmus. The Batman The animated series The Batman featured a modified version of the JLA Watchtower which closely resembled the Hall of Justice. Batman, The Brave and the Bold The Hall of Justice appeared in the Batman, The Brave and the Bold episode Sidekicks Assemble. With a pastiche of the music played when the Hall appeared in Super Friends. Smallville The Wonder Twins appeared in the Smallville episode Idol, with Zan played by David Gallagher and Jaina played by Alison Scagliotti. Gleek did not appear physically, but a cartoonish image of him was shown on each of the twins' cell phones. Young Justice The Hall of Justice was featured in Young Justice as the Justice League's decoy base of operations. Additionally, Wendy and Marvin appear as classmates of Connor Kent and Megan Morse. The members of the Injustice League operate out of a base resembling the Legion's Hall of Doom. In the second season, approximations of the minority members created for Super Friends are introduced as teenagers given powers by the Reach. The group consists of Tye Longshadow, Asami Sam Kwazumi, and Eduardo El Dorado Jr. The exception is Black Vulcan, whose place is taken by Milestone Media hero Static. DC Nation Shorts The title of the Super Best Friends Forever DC Nation Shorts is a play on the title Super Friends. Additionally, Black Vulcan's costume can be seen in the background of the first Black Lightning short. The Farm League carries several homages to the Super Friends, including its narrator, characters used, and graphics. Video games. Injustice, Gods Among Us The Hall of Justice is a playable stage in Injustice, Gods Among Us. Toys. Superpowers Collection The Superpowers toy line was based on the final 2 seasons of Super Friends. Samurai, an original character from the show, and the Hall of Justice were both released. Plans for future waves from Superpowers would have also included El Dorado, Black Vulcan, and the Wonder Twins. Justice League Unlimited The toy line based on Justice League Unlimited released a 3-pack of figures from characters created for Super Friends, namely Black Vulcan, Apache Chief, and Samurai. They were chosen over the Ultimen characters that actually appeared in the JLU animated series, Juice, Long Shadow, and Wind Dragon. DC Super Friends Fisher-Price began to produce DC Comics characters in a kid-friendly toy line named after the Super Friends. DC Universe Classics Paying homage to superpowers, DC Universe Classics produced original Super Friends characters such as Apache Chief, Black Vulcan, El Dorado, Samurai, and the Wonder Twins. Parodies. Holy Musical Be It Man. Super Friends was mentioned at the end of the Star Kid Productions musical Holy Musical Be It Man. At the end of the musical, Batman, Robin, Superman, and the Green Lantern combine to form a League of Justice they call the Super Friends. This group consists of some of the members of the original Super Friends as well as some new additions. That 70s Show Super Friends was spoofed in an episode of That 70s Show with a dream sequence where the Super Pals made fun of Eric's Superman because Donna's Wonder Woman had given him a ring as a gift. "I got it at the mall," she exclaims. The episode featured Eric Foreman as Superman, Donna as Wonder Woman, Kelso as Batman, Fez as Aquaman and Hyde and Jackie as the Wonder Twins. Red was also featured as their nemesis Dr. Bald, wearing Lex Luthor's green and purple costume. The Fairly Odd Parents In the Fairly Odd Parents episode Pow Pals, Timmy wished for better Super Friends. As a result, he got a team of superheroes the Power Pals as friends. The 4 characters parodied famous characters including Superman, Wonder Woman, Batman, and Aquaman, and came with their own narrator. Aspects of Super Friends were parodied such as randomly pressing beeping buttons on any computer module, invisible vehicles, the perceived uselessness of Aquaman parody Wet Willie's ability to talk to fish and powerlessness outside of water and near instantaneous travel to distant galaxies. MTV's The State During a transition between 2 other skits on MTV's The State, there was a brief scene with members of the state dressed as Super Friends. The Flash ran in, informing them of an impending disaster. Superman then began assigning serious tasks to all of the members, finishing by saying, "And Aquaman, go talk to some fish." The Super Friends then began laughing hysterically, while a visibly embarrassed Aquaman just stood there. South Park The South Park episode Super Best Friends was a spoof of the series, depicting religious figures as a team of superheroes. The only member of the Super Best Friends, who was not a religious figure is Seaman, a spoof of Aquaman whose power was to talk to fish. In 200 the parody was revisited. The opening sequence for the Super Best Friends took its cues from the Super Friends cartoon. Each of the religious figures and Seaman's introductions resembled the Super Friends opening. Jesus was Superman, Buddha was Wonder Woman, Krishna was Batman and Seaman was Aquaman. Joseph Smith and Lao Tzu acted as Wendy and Marvin White. In 201, Tom Cruise's house was described as the Legion of Doom headquarters. The episode Crazy Cripples features a Legion of Doom with Christopher Reeve as the leader. The episode Spooky Fish featured a Super Friends-style scene transition, with images of Barbra Streisand's head superimposed over the trademark lens flares. Family Guy In the Family Guy episode A Hero Sits Next Door, there was a cutaway joke involving Peter playing a game of strip poker with Wonder Woman. Super Friends-style scene transitions appear twice in the episode. In Fast Times at Buddy Science Jr. Hi, Peter flashed back to the time he was a Wonder Twin, taking the form of Jana's tampon. In Perfect Castaway, when Lois told Peter how well the family had been doing ever since she married Brian, she mentioned that Meg went on a date with the Super Friends announcer. Then a scene shows Meg and the announcer in a car on a hill where the announcer says, "Meanwhile, underneath Meg Griffin's bra." In PTV, Apache Chief helps Peter install a satellite dish for his unauthorized TV station. In No Meals on Wheels, Peter made a reference to the Mexican Super Friends. A non sequitur showed Mexican versions of superheroes, including Mexican Superman, and Mexican Batman. In It Takes a Village Idiot, and I Married One, when Lois ran for mayor she attempted to gain the stupid vote by claiming Adolf Hitler was working with the Legion of Doom to plot the assassination of Jesus. Shortly after this, the Legion of Doom's base rose from the lake and Lex Luthor asked the other Legion members how she knew their plans. Solomon Grundy admitted he kinda dropped the ball on that one. The opening of Family Guy parodied the opening sequence of Super Friends with Peter as Superman, Brian and Stewie as Batman and Robin respectively, Lois as Wonder Woman, Chris as Aquaman and Meg as Meg. In Something Darkside, shortly after Chris Luke and Cleveland R2-D2 landed on Dagobah, the Legion of Doom fortress rose from the swamp with the same narration and music. Chris Luke yelled, "Not now!" and the fortress quickly sank. Dexter's Laboratory One of the backup segments in Dexter's Laboratory was called Justice Friends. The title was derived from the Justice League and Super Friends, and the series made references to the superficial plot lines of the Super Friends shows. However, the characters were parodies of Marvel Comics' Avengers team. Heavy.com an ongoing animated series, featuring controversial celebrities Paris Hilton, Nicole Richie, Lindsay Lohan, and the Olsen twins in the roles of tasteless superheroes, was created in 2006 by Heavy.com. Both the setting and some of the girls' superpowers were plays on elements from Super Friends. Mad In early episodes of the animated series Mad, a few of the PSAs were remade which it was called Supervillains. There have currently been two of these, one about health and the other about safety. In one sketch, Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman are convinced to change the name from the Super Friends to the Justice League after a musical appeal by fellow heroes. References. External links, Super Friends at the Internet Movie Database, Super Friends at TV.com, Will's Ultimate Super Friends Episode Guide. Super Friends at BatmanYTB.com, Super Friends at Patsys.com, Super Friends at Legions of Gotham.